This week on The Futurists, Jeff Jarvis.
As a society, I think we need to rethink how we recognize and reward the behaviors and the creation that we want, and we've barely begun.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick with my co-host and best friend, Brett King. Hey, Brett, how you doing today?
Yeah, good. Hey, looking forward to this one. It's good to have Jeff back.
Yeah, we're excited to have you back. So welcome back, Jeff Jarvis. A lot's been changing in your world. Last time I talked to you, you were stepping down from your professorship and you were going to retire. Now it sounds like you're busier than ever. Tell me what's happened in your world, Jeff.
Thank you, Robert and Brett, for having me back. It was great fun last time, so I hope we make this a regular thing. I retired, has air quotes around it. I'm working with two universities I can't announce yet on helping them to work on new programs in what I call internet studies, but especially technology and society. I also can't talk about this yet, but I'm hoping, knock wood, that I'll be editing a book series on AI and humanity. Wow. While I'm plugging, I have a book coming out from Basic this fall called The Web We Weave, Why We Must Reclaim the Internet from Moguls, Misanthropes, and Moral Panic. The sub-headline to that should be An Addiction to Alliteration. And so I'm trying to keep busy, working on a book about the linotype, going back in history, on my podcast This Week in Google AI Inside. So yeah, screw retirement.
Wow, you're a busy man. It's a funny thing. It's when we set out to finally take some time off, that's when we tend to get busy because all those projects that have been on the back burner come to the fore. Exactly. So folks who are listening, I strongly recommend Jeff's books. I've read them. He writes beautifully. We actually read the books that we talk about on this show, so we will look forward to that. And when your book comes out, we'll have you back. In the meantime, I noticed that you've been busy testifying, and you've done some good testifying, and people should be aware of this because, frankly, more people ought to do it. I know that a few months back, you testified to Congress about artificial intelligence and about, in particular, fair use of data. And you pointed out that journalists use fair use every single day. So we should be cautious if we're going to try to ring fence that or limit it further than it's already been limited. And I admired that stance because the other folks who were testifying were mostly publishers and people from the book industry. And they were there equipped with plenty of phony outrage so that they could get Congress to intervene and prevent the AI companies from scraping their data. But more recently, you've been in California. Tell me about your testimony to the California legislature, because I want our audience to know about that.
It all ties together. I never did this policy stuff, right? I'm a journalist. I was separate from it. I don't do it. But oddly, I've been hanging around in capitals lately. I testified before the Senate on, as you said, on AI and journalism in Washington. But then I ended up testifying virtually with the Illinois Senate over a news bill they were going to have. Then I got commissioned by the California Chamber of Commerce to write a paper at 41 pages on the California Journalism Preservation Act.
Oh, wow.
Which got me into a deep dive on a bunch of topics, but primarily about the news industry's efforts to extend copyright and diminish fair use. And in the case of the California bill, the original bill was a link tax, trying to charge platforms for the privilege of linking to news and bringing them benefit. It's changed into a different version now. There's a competing bill, which is they're all link taxes, but it's trying to argue that platforms should pay to access information, which to me is a tax on reading. And then we've seen other bills in New York. There was a bill, now a law, to give job credits to news organizations for the journalists they hire, which sounds okay, but it only benefits print publications. Print. How 1973 of them. A similar bill in Washington. In Illinois, they had a bill like California's first bill. That didn't pass, but they did some other things. So what we see happening around the country and around the world is the news industry trying to, once again, extend copyright, diminish fair use. Well, as I look back at the history of this, it's really interesting because it goes back to when print faced its first ever competitor as a medium for business, radio. And in the 1930s, there were two networks at the time, CBS and NBC. And the newspaper industry got them to strong-arm them into signing the Biltmore Agreement, which they agreed to kill their news operations, to have only 2 5-minute per day news updates that had to come from the newspapers, that could have no advertising, thus no revenue and profitability, that forbade commentators from discussing news events until 12 hours afterwards. They're awful. Newspapers are jerks.
This is 1923?
1933.
Yeah.
Oh, 1933.
It fell apart because the independent stations wouldn't do this stuff, A, and B, because newspaper moguls started buying radio stations, so they didn't want the restrictions themselves.
Right.
Same script plays when television comes along. The newspaper people are trying to say, oh, this medium is not good for news. It's not the right way to do it. Only print is the way to get news across. They shouldn't be allowed to do news. Then the same thing happens when the baby bells were allowed to do digital services. Then the same thing happens now with the internet, and the same thing is happening with AI.
Yeah.
And it's constantly the legacy industry using the clout that it gains through its journalism to try to gain protectionist legislation. And it works. It's working in California. One bill has passed the Senate there. One bill has passed the House. It worked in Washington. It's working in New York. It worked in Illinois. It's not working in Congress yet. But meanwhile, just one more second here, this starts from around the world. It started in Germany with the Leistungsschutzrecht, which is called the ancillary copyright. That's an extension of copyright. That led to the EU's copyright directive. There was also the Spanish link tax. And then we found in Australia, there was the media bargaining code, which was Murdoch and company strong-arming the platforms into paying them. Then it happened in Canada with Bill C-18. Now in Canada, Facebook, Meta, said, screw this. We're going to drop all news from all of our platforms. And they couldn't be forced to carry it because they too have freedom of expression. And what's happened since, the Google is paying 75 million US a year. They were paying some good amount anyway. The net result of all this isn't great. But what's happened to the platforms is they haven't lost any traffic. News had no value to them.
Yeah.
But
you mean like when Facebook cuts off the links in order to not have to pay penalties?
They didn't lose any traffic. They didn't lose any usage. However, the platforms lost 80% of their social traffic. They lost huge amounts of traffic themselves. It hurt them greatly. So the publishers try to say, oh, the links have no value. Well, there's the market test that shows that they do. So I went to Sacramento twice. First time was to talk with legislators' aides, which I'd never done. So I was in the lobby, right, doing that. It was a fascinating democratic experience of talking to them. And most of them were well prepared, knew their stuff. And then I went back to testify before a committee only about a month and a half ago. So that's my dalliance in democracy.
It's interesting that it's spreading around the world, right? So the newspapers, obviously, they know each other and they talk, and they've been looking enviously at the revenue that Google's pouring in. I guess the background of this story is that there's been a major shift in ad dollars from traditional media over to the internet. And that's been going on for many years. It's not new, but what's new is that they have diminished the revenue. Basically the dollars have moved from one column almost entirely into the digital column. And candidly, newspapers haven't done such a great job of building a digital business. And so they're envious. They want that money back. And so they're using the leverage they've got. And look, politicians like talking to the press. Politicians like news coverage. It helps them get reelected. It helps their constituents know that they're doing something. And so as a result, they're pretty open to hearing the message from publishers. And it's pretty easy to impose a tax on a company when there's just a few big companies to go after. It's like one big deep pocket to go after. So it makes for fairly easy hunting. What do you think? What's your prognosis? Like, how likely do you think it is that they're going to pass these two bad bills in California?
To your first point, Robert, I tried to say to the politicians, you don't need to be scared of publishers anymore. They don't buy their ink by the barrel anymore. They buy by the thimbleful, right? The LA Times has a penetration in LA County of less than 5%.
Yeah.
It doesn't set the agenda. It's not important anymore. The hedge fund owns papers are a mess. But you're right. The politicians still think that newspaper journalism is vox pop.
Yeah.
When it's the farthest thing from it. And so they've got to get past that mindset, and they need to start respecting independent media. A lot of the problems with all this legislation is that it didn't pay respect to Black and Latino media. and to digital media. In California, you have 100-year-old black newspapers. The original link tax wouldn't have benefited them at all because they were in print. You have Lookout Santa Cruz, run by Ken Doctor, which is a digital outlet in Santa Cruz, who is avowed to go kill the hedge fund-owned newspapers there, and has just won a Pulitzer. So the legislators need to start listening to those independent voices in those communities more than the publishers. And I think they were looking for an excuse to do that. I think that they want out a bit. So what's happening in California?
Oh, so your testimony was effective.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that at all. But you could hear them kind of say, "Give us an out." And Google has tried to give them an out. Google proposed an alternative. Importantly, just to back up for a second, in both Australia and Canada, the laws didn't actually take effect. They were forcing mechanisms. And in Australia, Facebook and Google paid up voluntarily, air quotes around the word voluntary. And so it didn't come into effect. California, Google got an exemption from the law. So what Google is seeking in California is to say, listen, we'll negotiate something. And then they proposed to use their unused innovation tax credits that the state could give out otherwise. They said, we'll start a fund, which is what I favor here in Illinois and here in New Jersey. We have a fund that comes from state money, but it's independently managed. And that's what Google's proposing in California.
Oh, so it's not like some politician's slush fund where they can direct it to the newspaper magnate of their choice.
Exactly. And that's a model I like. I mean, I like it in California. I like it in New Jersey. Well, first, I don't like government involvement in journalism at all. But if we're going to go over that barrier, then how do you do it well? I think a fund means that you have goals, you have a judgment, and you have accountability. So Google is proposing that. Now, I don't think it would work the same in Florida or Texas, because it would be the problem. God knows how they would use the money there. But in California, I think that if the legislators will listen, there's a chance that something can be negotiated with not just Google, but then they could bring in other tech companies, and they could end up with something that has real value for new journalism in the state. We'll see. I'm not making any bets.
Question for you about the legislation as proposed, the California legislation as proposed. You said that in one case it's a tax on reading, and in the Senate bill it's a tax on information, on data collection. In both cases, where does the tax money go? Does it go to the government? Does it go to independent journalists, or does it go into the pockets of hedge funds that own big newspapers?
Another great question. First, I have to use tax somewhat guardedly, because in some cases, what the legislators try to do is avoid new taxes and avoid the state budget, because that's all kinds of problems. So instead, what they're trying to do is force direct negotiation or arbitration, where the platforms pay directly to the news companies.
So the companies that have the legal funds to attack internet companies are the ones who are most likely to get a payout.
Well, then that's the next point. Who gets it? In the case of most of the California legislation, it is hedge funds. 18 of the top 25 newspapers in California are now controlled by hedge funds.
So this has nothing to do with news or better journalism.
No. And there's no accountability. There's no saying, well, what is this money going to do? The union, the journalists union in LA is for this, but I don't think they're being forward thinking enough, do I dare say, on the show called Futurists, because the money is fungible, right? It doesn't mean that it's going to stay in the newsroom or that it's going to benefit journalism. It's going to go into the pockets of the hedge funds.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the state of play right now. Now, since we are thinking about the future, let's talk about the implications of this. Who does own the news? There's all this, all these efforts right now to kind of ring fence content and protect it from machines.
Can we start with an even more basic question than that, right? Because let's think about how news is progressing and where it might be in 20 or 30 years, right? Because if you think about news has become, because of mechanisms like Twitter and so forth, real time, but there's also the fake news. But, if you watch science fiction movies, often the news is depicted just like CNN, or Fox today, on a TV screen with a ticker tape on the bottom. Yeah. But, like Jeff, as a journalist who studied the history of journalism, and seeing how it's gone from newspapers to radio to print to digital. What does news look like in 20 years' time, given the trends that we've seen over the last couple of 100 years?
So let me start by throwing a firecracker in the room. I've also written a post saying that the New York Times is broken. The Washington Post is now invaded by Murdochians from the UK. NPR and PBS and CNN are running scared and are rudderless. PBS better than the rest, but not watched. Murdoch is victorious too often. Sinclair is next aside him. We've already talked about the hedge funds. Old big media is broken. And I'm at the point of giving up on them. And I'm at the point of saying that we're only going to succeed, I think, in the future with independent media. And that's going to be messy and spotty and inconsistent and broken. But that's where I see the energy and the innovation. But we're also going to see things that have nothing to do with media. Look at what's happened as we speak in the last week. I was on the White Dudes for Harris call with 150,000 people the other day. There were 100,000 white women for Harris, 44,000 black women for Harris, 20-some thousand black men for Harris. These things are organized on their own using the platforms that now exist for anybody to organize them. I just saw that Doug Emhoff's ex-wife wants to organize a seniors for Harris for Doug's parents. I just saw, this is the funniest, greatest thing, Deadheads for Harris. And my wife pointed out that they're so stoned they couldn't get the date right. It was all screwed up. Like, hey, man, the song goes on forever. But my point is that's not media. That's not mediated. That's people taking action in the democracy on their own. And the tools aren't perfect, and the structure isn't perfect, and it's too vulnerable to big companies and idiots like Elon Musk. But I think that news will look absolutely nothing like the institutional news we had. And I would lament that if the institutional news were good, but right now it is not. So we need to build something new from the ashes.
How come? Why is institutional news not good? The people don't trust it. That's well understood, right? And there's plenty of alternative sources of news to flatter your biases, whatever those might be. And so people doubt the news. That's well understood. But actually, I think your point is good. The quality of journalism has gone down in mainstream publications. Is that a lack of resources? Are they investing less? Have they cored out the newsroom? Are there fewer editors?
It varies. If you're a hedge fund owned newspaper, you are cut to the marrow. But the New York Times is the best and the biggest we have.
Yeah.
And they're trying to prove their independence from their own readers, is my theory. You don't own us, because most of their money is now coming from the readers. Right. And they think that they're doing their job when they piss off everybody. And somebody I know recently tried to equate Trump attacking the media when Joe Biden criticized the media. And I said, no, Trump wants to destroy the institution. Biden wanted to improve it. Liberals want to improve it. I just put up a post on Medium this morning where I went through an hour going through just the last few hours on social of everybody who's pissed off at the New York Times. Tons of tweets and Blue Sky and Threads and Mastodon of people saying we've had it with the New York Times because of the both sidesism, because of the Eeyoreism, because of their efforts to say, well, look how fair we are by being mean to everybody. They're already saying, how long is Kamala's honeymoon going to last, right? They want to bring down every cloud and turn it into rain. And people are fed up with it. So there's an attitude there that has nothing to do with resources. The New York Times has plenty of resources. It's about, I think, not understanding their role in the world. One interesting anecdote from Marty Baron's memoirs. Marty was the editor of the Washington Post. And at one point in the book, he lamented that 80% of his readers were liberal. Well, that's the kind of reflex of old mass media, is I have to have everybody. But you don't have everybody, Marty. You had liberals, and you could serve them well by knowing that. Doesn't mean you pander to them. Doesn't mean you lie to them. Doesn't mean you don't tell them the truth. But it does mean that you could understand who the community was there to be served. And instead, they still try to be the mass. They still try to think that they can serve everybody all the same, and they have to piss off everybody all the same.
Is this a new version of both sidesism? That's the kind of long-standing lament about the descent of the news. The idea that, both sides, even if one side is completely lunatic, are going to get equal time.
Absolutely. I think that Jay Rosen at New York University has talked about this for a long time, that the press doesn't understand asymmetry. And when you have one side that is fascistic and the other side that is not, if you try to act like they're equal sides, then you've just moved the center, the Overton window, far toward the fascism. But the other thing that's interesting to me, Robert, the last few weeks now, or week, I guess it's only been a week, is that the press doesn't know how to deal with the joy and enthusiasm and excitement that we're now seeing on the left.
They have to rain on it.
Yeah, that's all they know to do. There must be some dark cloud in here somewhere.
We got to get these two sides fighting again.
Yes, exactly. Because what they want, people say to me all the time, "Oh, the Times is for Trump." No, I think that's simplistic. I think that's wrong. What they're for is chaos, because that's what they cover is chaos.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what drives newspaper sales.
Yes, that too.
Interesting about the New York Times is it's not really a news organization anymore. It's a game publisher that has, kind of like a Wired magazine style tech, warehouse of reviews called Wirecutter. And then they happen to own a newspaper called the New York Times. But I don't think people are aware that they've shifted. They've been successful in their digital media transformation. That's something to be supported and applauded. But it doesn't mean that they double down on the news. That's not how they succeeded.
Yeah, by the way, I'm not suggesting people should cancel their subscriptions to the New York Times. It still has good journalism. The Washington Post still has good journalism. We still need it. But all the more reason to be critical and wish for them to be better.
Tell me about the fate of magazines, because you were a magazine editor for a very long time, and there's a qualitative difference to flipping through a magazine compared to, say, a big newspaper, a broadsheet newspaper, and reading on a screen. I know a lot of people who say to me, "I can't deal with this. Like, I can't read the news on this screen."
So I love magazines. I wrote a book called Magazine for Bloomsbury, right? And as I researched that book, I founded the magazine Entertainment Weekly. I worked for People Magazine. I worked for TV Guide. I was a TV critic there. So I love magazines. I used to buy them by the pound. They used to have to double bag me coming out of Hudson News, right? But as I researched it, Robert, I think that I saw that certain magazines had their time. There were phases. There was the early Harper's. There was the Time magazine and the corporate magazines. There was the thick Vogue and Taste magazines. And then entertainment magazines and cultural magazines, pop culture like People and EW and so on. And so I think they all had arcs. But then what I saw was I think the magazine as a genre also had an arc. And I think it's coming to an end. Doesn't mean there won't be magazines. There's magazines published all the time. But try to find a newsstand anywhere, you can't.
Yeah, they're shrinking. That's true.
And they're very special interest.
I'm staring at a stack of New Yorker magazines over here that looks kind of forlorn and forgotten. There's a cobweb on it. I haven't looked at them in weeks, unfortunately.
It's a pile of guilt, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. But this is the thing, it's like this is large scale behavioral shift that we are seeing. And, we've seen it before. We saw it with each of those new successive generations of next technology media. We saw behavioral change around it. My kids don't understand the concept of having to wait till Wednesday night at 7:30 to see a TV show that you were looking forward to, right? They have no concept of that sort of consumption of media. So I think part of this is just, we do see this generational shift in terms of, even I've noticed my own attention spans watching, clips and watching TV shows and documentaries has changed because of all this short form stuff that we're consuming all the time now.
Yeah, you get impatient, right?
Yeah. But the other thing is, I argue, and I'll plug my last book that's out right now, the Gutenberg Parenthesis, is I argue in there that mass is dead. That what we saw in the age of print was mass. And I think that that's what's died, and we now have choice. And the media,
so much more highly
ecosystem
personalized.
Doesn't know what to do with that. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's roll to a break right now. We'll come back and we'll talk about how artificial intelligence is going to reshape our experience of the news. Maybe we'll have our own personalized news. We're going to take a break right now. You're listening to The Futurists, and our guest this week is Jeff Jarvis. See you in a minute.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurists podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and my co-host is Brett King, and today we're talking to Jeff Jarvis. And Jeff, right before the break, Brett brought up a good point, which is that there's been a big behavioral shift, and the way people access and consume information is very different from the way they did it in the print days of magazines and newspapers. And along with that is a shift in the content. It's not just the nature of the container and how we reach that container that's changed, but actually the content that's contained inside the container. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact on journalism of digital media, the supremacy of digital media?
In my book, I also examine this notion of content. Mm-hmm. And I think content, I think we discussed this the last time I had the pleasure and honor of being here, is a Gutenberg era notion. It fills things. And I think what the internet made us do, and not everybody's up to this point yet, is realize that that's an archaic view of looking at public discourse. Mm. What we're really talking about is public conversation. And content is one tool that we use, and information was contained in that thing we called content. But there's so many other ways to get to things. And so we went from a destination strategy in media. You have to come to the newsstand to buy my publication. You have to come to me to get it. To a search motif, thanks to the internet and Google, where I can ask for something and go find it. Mm-hmm. To a social motif, where people can recommend things to me and we can discuss them. And then in the early days of generative AI, we have a chat motif where I talk with the machine, but it can't do facts. We don't know what's what. And then what we're waiting for, I think, is the next stage of that is the agentic motif, the agent. Keep an eye out for this for me, machine. Tell me when something happens, right? And
kind of like Google News alerts, but on steroids.
Exactly, and personalized for me, and not wasting my time. Now, that presumes that AI can deal with facts, and right now, generative AI cannot. Mm-hmm. I think we need a next leap there. But then the question becomes, then we get into all kinds of copyright stuff. We get into all kinds of issues, is that those who generate information today do it in the package of content, and they think that their content has value. Well, no, what's valuable is what's inside of it, which is information or conversation or insight or context or education or all kinds of things, right? And that can be disembodied from the forms that we had, publications and content and articles and stories. And so then that throws everybody for a loop in terms of how we can support reporting, how can we support creativity, and so on. And I don't think there's any easy answers to be had there. There's a lot of fighting going on, especially over copyright. I got into a fascinating discussion with Hank Green on Twitter the other day, where he's trying to figure out about copyright and input and output from AI. And we see money grabs going on by the moguls, by Murdoch and Springer and Barry Diller, to get their bags of money out of the AI companies. It's not really buying content. It's buying their silence when it comes to lobbying and litigation. But as a society, I think we need to rethink how we recognize and reward the behaviors and the creation that we want. And we've barely begun.
This is interesting. So what we're talking about then is the framing sounds to me like this. You've got this mission, which is that there's news and information happening, and someone's got to gather that and package it up. And then we put it into a certain package based on a distribution mechanism, a way to get that message out to an audience that wants to look at it. And that means that it's going to be in a certain package that we can put a revenue model against. And that revenue model ultimately dictates the kind of news that we generate. I'm actually thinking now of the book, The Image, from 1961, Daniel Borstein's book, which is an excellent book, by the way. I just reread it, and it really holds up for the time that we're in. And that's where he talked about pseudo news events, fake news events, effectively. Hard to believe that was 1961, but his point was simple. Once you've built a distribution system that creates an audience, that gathers an audience that wants a certain amount of content, then you've got to fill that pipe every single day. But of course, that's not the way the news works, because some days there just isn't anything interesting that happened. It's pretty rare, but there are days like that. And so we end up filling the pipe with pseudo news or pseudo events. I bring this up because today we think that fake news is a new phenomenon, and sure, the ability to produce it at industrialized scale, at mass scale, is a kind of a new phenomenon. It's so easy to do. But Daniel Borstein's point was that this was very lively in 1961, and he goes through a great deal of detail about it. I think that now, as the internet has kind of unpackaged or disintermediated, or kind of freed the content from the container, it can be packaged in other ways, and we haven't quite figured out how to monetize that, how to make money off of that. Sometimes people say that we live in an information society, but I think we live in an attention economy. And whoever can garner lots of attention is the person who's going to be able to command the biggest bucks. Now, if you think about your own behavior on the internet as you're grazing and browsing and looking at news feeds or news aggregators or social media and so forth, who controls your information? Often it's the algorithm that's doing it. Often these days it's social media that's doing it. Relatively rarely are you going to a destination news site, kind of like the digital version of a newspaper, and consuming there. You might follow a link or click through, or you might read one article, and that might lead you to a couple of other articles, and then you linger at that newspaper site. But that is not the prevailing behavior. I think people tend to graze more, and this creates an existential problem for the newspapers, because what they sell essentially is a package of stories. That if you're only taking one single, it's a lot like the music business. Singles is a terrible business. Albums is a fantastic business. And the newspapers were in the business of selling albums of content, kind of the good, the bad. It's really like everything that fits in the New York Times, kind of that idea. But the internet does away with all of that. Now we're at the stage where artificial intelligence is going to be able to scour the web, essentially serving as kind of our own personal editor, or our own personal, finder, maybe newsreader, I guess, and presenting it to us, and maybe even repackaging it. And this is where we start to get into problems with copyright law and the ability to actually do that, to use that. But, one of the things that occurred to me when you were speaking earlier before the break is that there is a longstanding tradition of repackaging the news. This was the very issue that the newspapers had against radio. And candidly, I've worked in television, and every TV newsroom is filled with newspapers. That's what they're using as their raw material to compile today's stories. Like, what is breaking? What's happening right now? Follow up on this story from yesterday, find out what just happened, and so forth. And so there is this kind of implicit understanding that we're going to rehash and reuse and remix the stories that came out yesterday. And yet that's the issue when we allow machines to do that. That suddenly becomes an issue. That suddenly becomes incredibly controversial. And I know that this was your Senate testimony when you testified to Congress. This was the heart of what you were getting across. Why don't you recap that for us here? Because I think that might be the core issue that we're describing with AI.
Yeah, you just addressed a lot, so let me hit a couple of points.
I sure did.
No, it's great. It's great. So it so happens that I picked up Daniel Borstein's book, The Americans, The Democratic Experience, just yesterday, because I'm writing a chapter in my next book about the linotype, about typewriters. And he tells a fascinating little story in there, just a tiny thing, that when Sears Roebuck communicated with its customers, even though the typewriter had come out, for many years, it still communicated in handwriting, because customers wouldn't trust typewritten letters and thought they were mass produced, because only print could produce print, right? And same with the early days of print. It wasn't trusted because there was no sense of its authority. So part of this is just, I think, norms of what we expect with where we read things and do they have authority. Point one. Point two, the attention economy. Yes, it was created by mass media. It's what I think has corrupted the internet. I think that's what doesn't work anymore, and that's why we're having this huge fight, and we have to find new models. But we also have to find new mechanisms of authority. And to go back to history for just a second, when newspapers, when in the early days of the U.S., the early days of copyright in 1790, newspapers were not covered. In In the Postal Act of 1792, newspapers were allowed to send their copies to each other through the mails for free for the express purpose of cutting them up and sharing it and creating a national network for news. There was a job title called scissors editor to do that, right? And that notion of learning from each other and sharing was key. So when I testified before the Senate, now finally to get your question, I tried to remind media people that they depend upon the thing they accuse the AI of doing to them. That is to say, reading each other, learning from each other, repurposing that learning, that information in new and transformative ways. Fascinating to me, Robert, is about a week ago. As you know, there's a suit of the New York Times against OpenAI in which they're arguing you stole our soul, right? Well, about a week ago, the OpenAI, and I think is a very canny move, demanded to get huge swaths of reporters' files and notes from the New York Times. Now, as a journalist, my reflex is to say, oh my God, no, that's sacred. How could you dare ask that? Because whenever governments ask that, we say, no, we'll go to jail.
This is part of the discovery process in defending themselves against that lawsuit.
Right. And so what they're saying to the New York Times is, oh, you try to say to us that all your journalism is original. Well, let's see. Let's see how often you have in your file a clipping from the Washington Post or from the Guardian.
And do good journalists do that? Do they keep track of all their sources?
It's their job. Absolutely,
they have to. Okay.
Absolutely. And we want to know, where did you learn that? And maybe you want to match it. You want to call the same source or whatever, or you quote the person or you don't credit them or whatever. But we read each other and we learn from each other. That's how our world works. And so they're trying to say to the AI companies, you can't do that. We can do that, but you can't do that. And so the New York Times should beware the precedent it sets.
Yeah.
Because what if every source of the New York Times says, no, you can't quote me unless you pay me. No, it's mine. What if every newspaper says, I quoted that first? There was the old hot news doctrine, the AP tried to have years ago.
We broke the story. You can't write it. Yeah.
Right. In an enlightened society, no one can own information, only the treatment of it. So what I was trying to say is beware what you're doing with this, because the publishers and broadcasters who were there, the lobbyists, were saying that the AI companies can't even read their stuff, cannot have access to it unless they license and pay for it. They can't do what we do. Now, there is a question here in terms of acquisition. Books 3 is the learning set that was used to train some of the early AIs with tons of books.
Yep.
I have my doubt that they bought every book. So there's a problem there of acquisition of the content. But if OpenAI had just one subscription to the New York Times, as far as I'm concerned, they have the right to read it and learn from it and repurpose what they learn in that way.
Yeah, that's quite right. There's no law against reading the news, right? That is a free right, whether it's a human or a machine doing it on behalf of a human. There's no law against reading the news.
But both in the Senate discussion and in the new California bill about the news, there's an effort to say you cannot access, that's the verb they used in California, this information without licensing it. I think that's just incredibly wrong. But there's high emotion here. In the discussion yesterday with Hank Green, Hank's perfectly reasonable online, but some of the people came in, got really mad at me. How dare your thieving robot take what is of value?
Yeah.
I get the anger, but we've got to rethink this. And if you go back to the early days in my magazine book, one of the things I love is that Harper's Magazine, on its first page in 1850, said, our mission is to find the good stuff for you. It is to curate the best of the stuff.
Right.
Because that was a consumer need.
And Reader's Digest had the same mission.
Exactly. It's been the heart of media. So to your underlying point about the business model, the attention economy was an economy of scarcity.
Yeah.
I have your attention, somebody else doesn't. Well, now, and I'm gonna aggregate it into a mass so that you can sell your soap flakes only through me. Well, that's all gone now. Now there's an endless array and variety of voices in media, and that means that we have to completely and fundamentally rethink the business model that goes into, especially formerly ad-supported media, but also others. Also, I'm really curious because you've worked around these industries. What happens, Robert, with networks like MTV? You couldn't start that today. Netflix is trying to make money by subscription.
I have a contrarian take on this, actually.
Okay.
So thank you for asking. So for people who haven't been watching what's going on in traditional media, let's say traditional media consists of broadcast television, cable, and satellite TV, the cable TV bundle of yore. Everyone knows that's been unbundled, and now you have streaming services that deliver whatever you want to watch, whenever you want to watch it. It's all video on demand, and that kind of breaks this paradigm of watching TV by appointment, the way cable TV worked for most of our lives. So the conclusion then is that it's over, dead and done with. But that's not true. Those channels still exist. There's still plenty of people subscribing to them. But here's the weird thing, Jeff. A lot of cable TV channels now are zombie channels because the big media companies are trying to preserve their best content to put it behind the paywall of their streaming service. So they want to put the new shows, the new episodes on the streaming service where you have to pay a subscription fee. And they're kind of putting like reruns and stuff on cable, which is the origin of cable. That's what cable TV channels consisted of in the 1980s when it began. Was to take stuff from broadcast and put it into reruns. So they're now calling cable zombie channels. And there are a lot of these channels. If you look at cable, it's kind of dismaying because you've got ads for like weird medical ailments and, and then interspersed with TV shows you haven't even thought of for decades. So it just sort of feels like old stuff, and that's going to accelerate the decline of cable. So fast forward to the near future being, let's say 2026, 2027, when generative AI is capable of generating an episodic show that's of watchable quality. Now, that might be animation. It might not necessarily be live action. It might not be as good as a feature film, for instance, right? Some of these things might be very difficult to achieve, but I think it's a reasonable supposition that you'll get something watchable. It might look more like a video game clip than a show, but you will get something watchable. It'll be generated, and the cost of that will be at least 10 times cheaper than producing live action. And it could very well be 100 times cheaper than producing live action. Well, Jeff, what that would do is that would actually revitalize cable TV and satellite TV, or it'll supercharge fast the free ad-supported streaming services by creating fresh content, generating fresh content at a super low cost. So essentially what you've got is a bunch of distribution pipes right now that are under service. They're not filled with enough content to command an audience. And the content that they're putting them is kind of old news. It's kind of old stuff. Now, if we can change that to make it new, you might see an explosion of diversity. You might see hyper-localization. You might see hyper-personalization. You might see stories covered or stories told that previously couldn't make it on a broadcast medium because they couldn't command a big enough audience. But you can see like ultra niche channels emerging. So personally, I actually am excited by this vision because I think it's going to revitalize cable TV. It's going to revitalize the old television business in a way that broadcast never could do it, because broadcast has to be one for everybody, right? It's one person, one company broadcasting out to everyone. Now you can do microcast.
And that's no longer a cable bundle. Or is it?
Well, it could be. I mean, the point is that those cable pipes exist and they're not going anywhere. They're just sitting there, right? They're just not being filled with anything. I guess the thing I think my big takeaway here is that we tend to think of the media as this gigantic monolith, and it isn't. It consists of lots of different companies. They each have different competing agendas, and each has different strengths. And there are plenty of legacy companies that have distribution power. They have distribution channels that cost them billions to build up and aggregate. And now those channels are languishing. They're not being programmed in a very effective way or a very imaginative way. They're losing audience. And so they're kind of like empty pipes. And if generative AI can come and fill those pipes with something that's fresh and compelling, it actually might breathe new life into the old medium. Anyway, that's my optimistic viewpoint for today. Watch this space. I could be completely wrong in that speculation, but I think that's a very, very strong possibility. And I'm not just talking out my hat here, because actually I've spoken to a couple of people in television who've described this very problem to me, that they're trying to find ways to fill their channel. If you run a legacy satellite or cable channel, your biggest cost is your cost of content acquisition. Your second biggest cost is localization. So if you're running that channel in any territory that doesn't speak English as a first language, you're going to have to dub it or subtitle it. And these are tasks that AI is actually well suited for. So I think you might see a 10x reduction in cost in video production. And I think that actually might breathe new life into old business models and old distribution models.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think for this afternoon I do the This Week in Google podcast, and I put a story in there for the New York Times, just looking at how YouTube has taken over the television set and has more viewers than Netflix, Disney Plus, or Amazon Prime.
That's right. People don't notice that. It's true. We tend to think of YouTube as something you watch on a phone or on a tablet, but it's actually on a connected television. YouTube is twice as popular as any streaming service in every country in the world.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. They're serving the entire planet. They utterly dwarf Netflix, and nobody is aware of this.
And
With
we're
2
old
billion
enough to
viewers.
remember when people thought that Google overpaid for it.
It was actually a brilliant move, right?
It
Because
was.
they timed the shift to video. They understood this shift to video. That plus the ad stack. The other thing that Evan Shapiro, who I'm sure you know, he's very good at pointing out, is that Google has also pioneered a new kind of television advertising because YouTube is a two-way medium. It looks like video, it looks like broadcast, a one-way medium, but it isn't. It's two-way.
Amen.
And so they developed performance advertising. And of course, Google can do this because they've got the most effective ad stack in the world and the biggest ad network. So they've developed a new kind of advertising, performance ads for TV. So most broadcast advertising is display. That is, you're watching and it shows you an ad, and hopefully the branding is so spectacular that you'll remember it next time you go to the shopping center or the store. That's the way display advertising works, but there's no real way to track that to people making a purchase decision unless you do lots of expensive research about recall and so forth. That's hard, really hard to do scientifically. Performance advertising is different. You're watching an ad on a connected medium, a two-way medium, and something appealing is offered to you there and you click. Okay, we can track that click and we can go quite deep into the demographics of who clicked and when and how often. Do they go back? Is it repeat behavior and so forth? Well, Google's pioneered this for video, and that's the mainstay for YouTube. Now, about a decade ago, this was maybe 15% of TV advertising or video advertising. On YouTube today, performance ads, this kind of clickable advertising, is 77%. It's continuing to grow.
Much higher value in each case.
Much higher.
Not just volume, but greater value.
They've actually created their own kind of customer for this because there's an entire category of advertisers who don't advertise on television, cable, or other streaming services. They only advertise on YouTube because they get results they can't get anyplace else.
And data.
And as Evan pointed out to me, he said, look, if you're a manufacturer of a product and you spend $1 on YouTube and you get $2 of business back, he said, you're going to do that deal all day long. And as a result, there's a growing and rising number of people, companies that are buying YouTube performance ads. So the way I look at this, Jeff, is in the video business, if you take the whole video business in the United States, and that would include broadcast TV, cable and satellite TV, streaming services like Netflix and Disney Plus, and these new fast channels, the free ad-supported channels, and YouTube. If you put all those into one giant bucket and said that's the video business, that whole business is worth about $280 billion a year in revenue. That comes from advertising and transactions as well as subscriptions. That number hasn't changed since the pandemic. It hasn't changed. It hasn't gone up in 5 years. Costs continue to go up. So you've got a real problem if you're a legacy TV company because your costs are skyrocketing. Everybody feels compelled to feed these new streaming services with great new shows. So they're spending a lot of money on the shows, but the total revenue pie hasn't grown at all. And YouTube is getting a bigger and bigger and bigger piece of that revenue pie. So they're actually eroding traditional media. This story hasn't been widely reported, and I do need to credit Evan Shapiro for giving me the tip about YouTube. It's a big story. I think it's really powerful. There's one more piece, if you don't mind me jumping on the soapbox here. There's one more piece about YouTube that's really powerful. So you'll remember back in around 2010, just about 14 years ago, Apple had come out with the iPhone that was becoming successful, but it was still very early days for the iPhone, right? The App Store wasn't introduced until 2008. And that's also the year when the Android phone started to gain traction. But within a couple of years, just by 2010 or 2011, those two smartphones started to displace all the other smartphones on the market, all the products that were made by Nokia and NEC and Ericsson. And so they started to get kind of go to the elephant's graveyard of technology. And Google did a really smart thing. They were like, we're never going to beat Apple in hardware. So let's just license our operating system to all these legacy handset manufacturers. And now, if you're building a smartphone, you do need an operating system because it's a kind of computer. Most hardware companies are terrible at software. So they were quite happy to take the Android operating system from Google. And what did Google get in exchange? The advertising. They controlled the stack, and they also had a number of apps that were embedded. So they actually got a gigantic footprint, about 5 times the size of the iPhone. We all know that story. That story is from more than 10 years ago. And as a result, the Android operating system is the fastest growing operating system in history. Well, they're doing it again with television. Now they're going to the manufacturers of TV sets. And I worked for Sony. I know the electronics business reasonably well. making TV sets is not a great business. It's like running a grocery store. There's a 1 or 2% profit margin if you're lucky. For many years, Sony lost money on every TV that it sold. So what you don't have if you're a TV manufacturer is a budget to build your own operating system. And yet the new connected TVs are kind of like computers. They need an operating system. Here comes Google. And they now have a Google operating system for television, and they're actually paying TV manufacturers for the real estate. They're giving them money up front to put their operating system in those devices, and they're doing this around the world.
Free margin. Yep.
They are doing this in emerging markets, places where there isn't a sophisticated ad market yet. And it's hard work to build an ad market there, but Google is probably the best positioned company in the world to do it. And so not only is YouTube ascendant as the stuff people watch, but it's pulling in. It's like the locomotive that is now pulling in an operating system play that'll replicate Google's success with the Android operating system for mobile phones. This is a big deal, Jeff. I bought Google stock as soon as I heard about this because I said, oh, they're defining a whole new vision for television in the 21st century, which is targeted performance advertising in every market in the world. That's a gigantic category for them. There is literally nobody else in the space right now.
I agree. I got called maybe I shouldn't say this, but I got called by a lawyer to whether I want to be an expert testimony about antitrust and online advertising. I said, well, I've written about this, so I don't think you want me. Because I think the one area where Google is vulnerable is that they have hegemonic control over much of advertising out of their brilliance. I want to get one more point. I know we're running out of time, but,
No,
but I
good.
think I see the Android model and the YouTube model you just spoke, which by the way also goes to car operating systems.
Yeah.
I also think I see Meta doing this with AI. By Meta making Llama open source, or actually better said free,
Yeah.
I think that's an Android strategy.
Sure. They're trying to get the developers, right? And
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it pulls the rug out from everybody else, from OpenAI and those companies that are trying to find value in what they're doing. No, I can go to meta.ai and I can do anything I want today with the best model there is.
It's the classic move, right? This is how Google originally scorched earth strategy against Microsoft, right? They made it impossible for Microsoft to make money with Windows as an operating system.
Right.
You know, people forget, but back in the 1990s, when you bought a PC for $2,000, most of that money that you spent didn't go to the manufacturer like Compaq or Dell. Most of the money went to Microsoft for the operating system and Intel for the chip inside of it.
And I now have a Chromebook where the operating system is free.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a scorched earth strategy. I think you're quite right about that. Meta makes money in other ways. They can afford to indulge in this space. And so they're going to do a scorched earth strategy on OpenAI.
Yeah, they can say, the hell with you. Jan LeCun, who's really smart, is their head of AI. And I think they ruin the strategy for the VC-run companies trying to do only AI.
Fascinating. Jeff, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. You are a fountain of wisdom and lore. We bounce back and forth effortlessly between the history of media and the future of media, and it's great. There's a continuum. I know you're not a huge fan of the term futurist, but you're an honorary member of the club.
I wear it with pride. Thank you.
Thanks. That's great fun. Well, good luck with the books that are coming out. Where's the best way for people to find you? Give us your URLs or your links.
Easiest way, my old blog is buzzmachine.com, and there I'll link to other stuff. But I'm on the socials at Jeff Jarvis. I'm obnoxiously everywhere.
Okay, great. So buzzmachine.com is the best starting point.
Yeah.
Okay, super. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for joining us. It was great to have you on the show, as always. And folks, we'll be back next week with another person who is thinking, shaping, and influencing the future. I'm Rob Tersick. Unfortunately, Brett was unable to stick around. They're having storms in Thailand, which is where he's at. And so his internet connection was a little bit unstable. So he dropped off, but he'll be back. We'll have more for you in a week. And until then, we'll see you in the future. Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.